Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. The story of Sudan begins with a border drawn in the mind. For centuries, this hallway between Sahara and Nile had been a marketplace of worlds. Arab traders pushing down from the north, black African kingdoms rising from the south, herders crossing season by season. Under Anglo-Egyptian rule, these streams were split by design. A double government that prepared the north as Arab-Muslim and sealed the south behind missionary schools and few roads. It was not just governance. It was separation as policy, a quiet partition long before any map said so. In Khartoum, the capital grew around government buildings and mosques tied to Cairo. Arabic, the language of office and ambition. In Equatoria and the swamps of the White Nile, English primers and religious books arrived with too few teachers and even fewer clinics. While northern officials were blocked from travel into the south, the effect was a social dam. Two systems, two curricula, two imaginations of what Sudan ought to be. The future independence everyone spoke of would inherit these fault lines like hairline cracks in glass. After World War II, the decolonizing wind swept Africa, but left Sudan's house divided. Northern politicians debated their place in the Arab world. Southern leaders asked for autonomy, a federation, anything but absorption. London, impatient to leave, engineered Sudanization to hand the state to Sudanese bureaucrats. Yet, out of some 800 senior posts, only 6 went to Southerners. The message felt unmistakable. Unity would mean rule from the north. Rumor did the rest. Southern garrisons whispered that new northern units, hard men with harder reputations, were coming to replace them. In Torit, on August 18, 1955, the Equatoria Corps mutinied, killing northern officers before fleeing into the bush. The revolt was suppressed quickly, but the fire leapt from barracks to village, from rumor to retaliation. The first murders were not lines in a communique. They were screams in doorways, huts burned, families scattering toward forest paths. Britain lowered the Union Jack and exited. And in January 1956, Sudan raised its flag over a city of celebration and suspicion. The army, the civil service, the ministries, almost all northern, almost all centered in Khartoum, announced unity, while the South counted how few of its voices were at the table. Independence, then, was not a union completed. It was a truce declared over unfinished arguments. The North spoke of destiny. The South remembered Torit. Across the next months, the government promised reconciliation that never arrived, while soldiers swept the hinterland, searching for bandits. What the South saw were old patterns with new uniforms, patrols, reprisals, and officials who treated their districts like conquered ground. The violence did not yet look like a civil war. It looked like a fever that would not break. But fevers speak of deeper infections. In marketplaces and mission yards, people learned a new vocabulary. Anya, Equatoria, mutiny, words that tasted like metal on the tongue. The first refugees crossed into Uganda and Congo, carrying stories most of the world would not hear and would not believe if they did. A nation had been born, yes, but one half of it felt like an afterthought, the other half like the only author of the script. Sudan stepped onto the world stage already limping. What began as a division of classrooms and checkpoints had become a division of memory and fear. In the north, the narrative was order threatened. In the south, it was dignity denied. Between them lay a silence into which rifles would soon speak. The first Sudanese civil war did not start with a declaration. It started with a whisper that no one powerful enough chose to hear. The fire that began in Torit spread with terrifying speed across the southern provinces, Equatoria, Bahr el Ghazal, Upper Nile. The mutiny became contagion. Soldiers fled into the forests and swamps, forming loose bands of fighters. In Khartoum, the government branded them bandits. Yet the bandits learned quickly. They struck convoys at night, melted into the bush by dawn, and vanished into the labyrinth of the Nile's tributaries. The North called it rebellion. The South called it survival. The war had no front lines, only boundaries drawn in fear. Villages became minefields of rumor. A word to the wrong visitor could mean execution. Soldiers burned crops, accusing farmers of hiding rebels. Rebels retaliated by ambushing garrisons and torching supply depots. The violence was circular, unending, and invisible to the world beyond Sudan. Foreign newspapers rarely printed its name. There were no cameras, no headlines, only graves that multiplied beneath the rains. Yet, even within the chaos, a purpose was forming. By the early 1960s, the fragmented resistance began to come together under a single name: Enyanya, snake venom in the Madi tongue. It was a declaration as much as a title. The South would no longer plead. It would bite. In exile, Southern leaders such as Joseph Otaho and Agri Jaden tried to turn scattered rage into a political cause. They met in Uganda, Congo, and Ethiopia, searching for unity but finding mistrust. Each tribe carried its own wounds, each leader his own ambition. Still, a whisper of recognition stirred across the borders. The South's struggle was not tribal, but existential. The North, meanwhile, descended into its own instability. The post-colonial dream quickly soured into a carousel of coups. Civilian cabinets rose and fell. Generals replaced generals. The army built to defend unity was now consumed by it. To Khartoum's rulers, the Southern War was both distraction and necessity, a reason to tighten control and rally Arab identity against the African periphery. Religion became a weapon of politics. So did famine. By the late 1960s, the war's toll had reached unbearable proportions. Nearly 500,000 were dead, most of them civilians. Entire towns lay in silence, their schools and churches charred, their roads swallowed by jungle. Children were born knowing only the sound of retreat. Yet from that exhaustion came the faintest possibility of peace. The Organization of African Unity, sensing the danger of a conflict that could spill across borders, began mediating secret talks in Addis Ababa. In 1972, after 17 years of slaughter, the talks succeeded. The Addis Ababa Agreement granted the South a degree of autonomy unseen in its history. A regional assembly, a local army, a government based in Juba. For a moment, it seemed the venom had run its course. The guns fell silent. Refugees returned, markets reopened, and children slept through the night for the first time in a generation. But beneath the celebration, the truce was built on sand. The North signed out of fatigue, not conviction. The South accepted from necessity, not trust. The document promised reconciliation, but no one could name what that meant. The war had not ended. It had merely learned to hold its breath. For the first time in living memory, Sudan was whole again, but like a bone reset poorly, it would break at the same place once more. The silence that followed the Addis Ababa Agreement felt miraculous. After 17 years of horror, the rifles were still, the air clear of gunfire. In Juba, children who had grown up hiding in swamps now walked to school in uniforms stitched from donated cloth. Refugees came home with bundles of tools and seeds, and markets returned to life. The war seemed like a distant storm that had finally drifted out to sea. Sudan, for the first time in a generation, dared to breathe. The Southern Regional Government was born, a fragile experiment in autonomy headquartered in Juba and led by former rebel commander Joseph Lagu. Ministries were staffed, laws drafted, and teachers hired. Roads that had been battlefields were graded again. Planes carried more passengers than bombs. In the north, President Jafar Naimiri, who had seized power in a 1969 coup, proclaimed a new era of unity. But his definition of unity was not the South's. For him, the Addis peace was a concession to be managed, not a partnership to be honored. During the early years, the illusion held. Naimiri courted Arab investors and Western donors, selling Sudan as the next modernizing miracle of Africa. American engineers built dams. Gulf states funded new highways. Oil companies scouted the frontier. Yet, the wealth barely touched the South. Bureaucrats in Khartoum monopolized contracts, ministries, and foreign loans. To the people who had fought and bled for autonomy, the old inequality had simply put on a new suit. Then came the discovery that would poison the peace. Oil explorers struck black gold in the borderlands between North and South, especially around Bentiu in the Upper Nile region. Both sides claimed it as their own. Naimiri, unwilling to let the South control the new treasure, quietly redrew the regional boundary lines, placing the oil fields under northern administration. The Southern Assembly protested, but their words dissolved in Khartoum's wind. The money in the pipelines flowed north, while resentment began seeping back southward like oil through sand. As the decade wore on, Nimiri began to change. Once a socialist, he reinvented himself as an Islamic reformer to win Arab support. Under pressure from clerics and the Muslim Brotherhood, he began speaking of national purification. Mosques flourished, liquor was banned, and the rhetoric of Sharia law crept into every speech. To the Christian and animist South, this was not unity. It was erasure. Inside the Southern government, divisions widened. Ethnic rivalries between Dinka and Equatorian elites erupted into corruption and intrigue. Former comrades turned on each other. Funds disappeared. The once promised dream of self-rule curdled into factionalism. Many Southerners began to wonder if they had traded one oppressor for another, only now under a Southern banner. In Khartoum, Nimiri watched and waited. By 1980, he began dismantling the Addis structure piece by piece. The Southern Army was dissolved. Its officers transferred north or dismissed. Regional boundaries were redrawn to split the South into 3 smaller provinces, each easier to control. The final insult came when northern garrisons replaced southern units, reopening the wounds that had never fully healed. And then in 1983, the dam broke. Nimiri declared that Sharia law would apply across all of Sudan, ignoring the faiths of millions. In the town of Bor, a southern battalion mutinied rather than obey. Their leader was a Dinka officer named John Garang de Mabior, an economist trained in the United States, disciplined, visionary, and relentless. Garang did not fight for revenge. He fought for an idea, the new Sudan, a secular federal nation where identity would not determine destiny. But ideals like oil ignite easily. Within weeks, Garang's soldiers took to the bush, and the familiar echoes of rifles returned to the night. The peace that had lasted 11 years collapsed in a single season. The illusion of a united Sudan dissolved once more, leaving behind the bitter truth. The wounds of the past had never closed. They had only been bandaged. From the ashes of false peace, a new war began, one far larger, more organized, and more ideological than the last. The Second Sudanese Civil War had arrived. When the guns roared again in 1983, they did so with purpose. The rebellion in Bor was not another scattered mutiny of frightened soldiers. It was the birth of a movement with a mission. At its heart stood Colonel John Garang de Mabior, a man of contradictions, educated in Iowa, trained in Tanzania, and hardened by the South's memory of betrayal. Garang was both idealist and strategist. He envisioned not simply Southern secession, but a new Sudan, a nation remade on equality, secularism, and democracy. Yet the soil he sought to cultivate had been watered too long with blood. Garang's vision found an army, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, SPLA, and its political arm, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, SPLM. Its ranks swelled with former soldiers, students, farmers, anyone who had lost a home to Khartoum's rule. In the training camps of Ethiopia, under the shadow of Mengistu Haile Mariam's Marxist regime, they learned not only to fight but to believe. "We are the new Sudan," their commanders told them. "We do not seek revenge, we seek rebirth." But belief alone could not sustain a war. Supplies came from Ethiopian ports, arms from sympathetic governments, and money from sympathetic churches. The SPLA struck across the South in waves, raiding garrisons, ambushing convoys, sabotaging pipelines. Government troops, poorly trained and desperate, retaliated with fury. Entire villages were erased from maps. The North called it counterinsurgency. The South called it extermination. By 1985, the conflict had consumed the southern third of the country. Towns like Bor, Malakal, and Wau became names whispered with dread. Fields lay fallow, schools vanished, and famine followed the armies like a shadow. The Sudanese government, desperate to preserve control, declared martial law and unleashed militias that operated beyond restraint. In the name of unity, they committed atrocities that would scar generations. Yet, Garang's SPLA was no saint. The movement's rhetoric of liberation was undercut by its own authoritarianism. Dissenters disappeared. Rival commanders were executed. Civilians found themselves caught between two monsters, Khartoum soldiers by day, the rebels by night. The same young men who once dreamed of freedom were now burning the villages of their enemies. Every ideology in the end was swallowed by survival. Meanwhile, the north itself was crumbling. Civilian governments rose and fell like paper tents in a storm. Inflation devoured wages and the cost of war hollowed the treasury. Khartoum's alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood deepened while whispers of another coup spread through the barracks. To the generals, Islam offered not only faith but discipline, a tool to bind the fracturing nation under divine authority. The Cold War gave the Sudanese tragedy its cruel symmetry. Ethiopia's Marxists armed the SPLA while the United States, fearing Soviet influence, funneled quiet support to Khartoum. Libyan aid, Arab oil money, and foreign arms dealers turned Sudan into a proxy chessboard. Each shipment of rifles ensured that peace would remain impossible. By the decade's end, 500,000 were dead and millions displaced. Entire regions were emptied of life, their people scattered across Uganda, Kenya, and the Congo. Khartoum's control shrank to the railways and the capital. The SPLA held the countryside, but not the cities. It was a stalemate written in starvation. Then, in June 1989, the last remnants of Sudan's democracy collapsed. A coup led by a little-known officer, Brigadier Omar Hassan al-Bashir, swept the government away. Behind him stood a civilian ideologue, Hassan al-Turabi, the architect of Sudan's Islamist movement. Together, they promised order, purity, and the rule of God. In his first broadcast, Bashir's voice was calm, his words rehearsed. "We shall rebuild this nation in the image of faith." But for the South, the message was unmistakable. A holy war had begun. Under the banner of jihad, the Second Civil War entered its darkest chapter. The dream of a new Sudan had collided with a vision of divine conquest. And between them, a country already in ruins would begin its final descent. When Omar al-Bashir seized power in June 1989, Sudan awoke to a new kind of dictatorship, one veiled in the language of divine salvation. Guided by Islamist theorist Hassan al-Turabi, Bashir proclaimed a holy mission to unite the country under God and purge it of corruption, rebellion, and disbelief. From the capital, sermons thundered that the war in the south was no longer political. It was jihad. The state's new soldiers were promised paradise, their enemies eternal damnation. This was no longer a war to hold territory, but to reshape souls. Government planes dropped leaflets by day and bombs by night. Markets and hospitals were targeted alongside rebel camps. Entire towns were marked rebellious and razed. To the men in Khartoum, faith justified everything. To the civilians in the south, it was indistinguishable from genocide. The Sudan People's Liberation Army fought on, but victory was an illusion. John Garang's forces held vast lands yet fractured within. Ethnic divisions, power struggles, and hunger hollowed the movement. In 1991, Garang's deputies, Riek Machar and Lam Akal, split from the SPLA, accusing him of tyranny. Their new faction, SPLA Nasir, turned its guns on former comrades, igniting a war within the war. Civilians paid the price. Thousands were massacred in tribal vendettas, and whole communities were driven from their homes by men who once fought side by side. By the early 1990s, famine became a weapon. Khartoum blockaded relief convoys arguing they would feed the rebels. Aid organizations were expelled and fields lay untended. In Bahr el Ghazal, starving families ate tree bark and clay. Mothers buried infants in unmarked pits. The famine of 1998 alone claimed over 70,000 lives, most of them children. International journalists who reached the region called it a famine by design. At the same time, Bashir's Sudan was becoming the crossroads of global extremism. After his expulsion from Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden arrived in 1991 with his entourage of engineers and financiers. He built roads, farms, and factories, preaching jihad while funding networks that linked North Africa to Afghanistan. For a brief moment, Khartoum became the unlikely capital of militant Islam, home to fugitives, training camps, and quiet deals. The West responded with isolation. The United States placed Sudan on its list of state sponsors of terrorism in 1993. Sanctions soon followed. Yet, this isolation strengthened Bashir's grip. The regime tightened censorship, controlled trade, and exploited oil reserves newly discovered in the south. The first pipelines finished in the late 1990s pumped wealth straight to Khartoum, enriching generals while war zones starved. But even in triumph, fissures widened. Bashir's alliance with Torabi fractured as both men competed for supremacy, one wielding the army, the other the mosques. When Bashir finally sidelined Torabi in 1999, he emerged not as a servant of Islam, but its master, blending faith and fear into a machinery of control. Meanwhile, in the south, Garang's movement, battered, divided, but unbroken, began to adapt. Famine forced cooperation with humanitarian groups through the UN's Operation Lifeline Sudan, a tenuous lifeline that fed millions while exposing the world to the scale of the disaster. The SPLA rearmed, reorganized, and reclaimed lost ground, even as its fighters marched barefoot and half-starved. By decade's end, 2 million were dead and 4 million displaced. Villages were gone, replaced by camps that stretched for miles across the borders of Uganda and Kenya. A generation had grown up without knowing peace, cities, or even paper money. Only war and waiting. Yet, in the unlikeliest corners, change stirred. Oil exports brought Khartoum sudden wealth but also dependence. Could not drill without foreign expertise or Western markets. And Western governments pushed by activists and churches horrified by Sudan's atrocities began demanding negotiation. Within Bashir's own circle, fatigue and doubt crept in. For the first time in 2 decades, the regime's certainties began to crack. The jihad that promised salvation had brought only famine, sanctions, and shame. And through those cracks, the faintest glimmer of diplomacy began to seep, thin as dawn over a wasted plain. The south still bled, the north still prayed, and both were starving. But after 20 years of ruin, even the architects of Sudan's tragedy began to ask if endless war could be sustained forever. The next chapter would not bring redemption, but it would bring a fragile, costly peace. By the turn of the millennium, Sudan was a nation staggering under the weight of its own wars. 2 million had died, 4 million more had fled their homes, and yet the fighting still dragged on, without victory, without meaning, without end. The world had mostly looked away. But in the early 2000s, something changed. The war on terror had begun, and Sudan, once branded a hub for extremists, suddenly became useful again. In the aftermath of September 11th, Washington saw Khartoum not as a pariah to be punished, but as a potential source of intelligence. Omar al-Bashir seized the opportunity. In a move that stunned his old allies, he turned on the very Islamists who had built his regime. Hassan al-Turabi, once the ideological mastermind behind Sudan's jihad, was thrown into prison. Bashir purged the mosques of radicals, expelled foreign militants, and offered quiet cooperation to the CIA. The dictator who once harbored Osama bin Laden now sold information about him. For the first time in decades, Khartoum found the world willing to talk. At the same time, both armies were exhausted. The SPLA had gained ground, but not victory. Garang's troops held much of the south, but the countryside was shattered, its people skeletal from famine. The Sudanese armed forces were stretched thin, its morale broken. The war had become a stalemate of ghosts, 2 sides too weak to win, too proud to stop. Diplomacy began to fill the void. The Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, backed by a coalition of mediators known as the Troika, the United States, Britain, and Norway, revived peace negotiations in Kenya. Years of cautious talks followed, first in Machakos, then Naivasha. For once, both sides were pressured to stay. The North needed legitimacy. The South needed relief. The world, newly attentive to Sudan's oil and humanitarian crisis, demanded resolution. In 2003, the Machakos Protocol was signed. It was revolutionary in its simplicity. The South would be granted autonomy for 6 years, after which a referendum would decide whether it would remain in Sudan or become independent. For the first time in history, Khartoum formally acknowledged the South's right to self-determination. It was a concession extracted by decades of blood. But even as diplomats toasted progress, a new war ignited to the west. In Darfur, long neglected and drought-stricken, non-Arab communities rebelled against Khartoum's marginalization. Bashir responded with the same playbook, this time under a new name, the government-armed tribal militias, the Janjaweed, to crush the rebellion by erasing its people. Villages burned, wells were poisoned, and the pattern of extermination spread across the desert like wildfire. The irony was cruel. Even as Sudan negotiated peace in the south, it waged genocide in the west. Still, the southern process pushed on. By 2004, years of mediation yielded the Comprehensive Peace Agreement (CPA). On January 9, 2005 in Nairobi, Bashir and Garang stood side by side to sign the document that promised to end Africa's longest war. The world celebrated. The South would govern itself under the SPLM. Oil revenues would be shared equally. A joint army would guard the fragile truce. When Garang returned to Khartoum, he was greeted as a hero. For the first time, Northerners and Southerners cheered the same man. His dream of a new Sudan, united not by ethnicity or faith, but by equality, seemed within reach. On July 9th, he was sworn in as first vice president, a rebel commander now standing at the heart of the state that once hunted him. It felt like a moment when history itself had turned a corner. But history in Sudan has never been kind to dreamers. 3 weeks later, Garang's helicopter crashed in the mountains of southern Uganda. There were no survivors. The official report called it an accident. The streets of Khartoum and Juba called it sabotage. Riots erupted overnight. Hundreds died. The fragile trust the peace depended on began to unravel before it had even begun. Salva Kiir Mayardit Garang's deputy stepped into leadership. He was pragmatic, cautious, and unlike Garang, uninterested in unity. For him, peace meant separation and independent South Sudan. The countdown began, 6 years until the referendum that would decide whether Sudan remained one nation or split forever. For now, the guns were silent. The ceasefire held. Children in Juba returned to school. 8 convoys replaced bombers, but the illusion of progress masked a deeper truth. In Darfur, the killing raged on. In the north, power remained clenched in Bashir's hands. And in the south, new factions waited for the moment to turn ambition into blood once again. Peace had come to Sudan, but only on paper. Beneath it, the seeds of another tragedy were already germinating. While the ink of the peace agreement in the south was still drying, Sudan's western frontier began to burn. The region of Darfur, larger than France, long ignored by Khartoum, had always been a borderland of dust and survival. Drought had shrunk the grazing lands, pushing Arab nomads southward into farms tended by non-Arab peoples like the Fur, Masalit, and Zaghawa. Where there was once barter and coexistence, scarcity bred suspicion, and suspicion bred blood. In early 2003, the neglected tribes of Darfur rose up. 2 new movements, the Sudan Liberation Army, SPLA, and the Justice and Equality Movement, JEM, declared rebellion against the government's abandonment and inequality. They accused Khartoum of treating Darfur like a colony and the Arab tribes as instruments of domination. To Bashir's regime, already juggling southern peace talks, the uprising was an intolerable humiliation. The government's response was swift, merciless, and chillingly familiar. Khartoum armed local Arab militias, men on horseback who called themselves Janjaweed, devils on horseback, and unleashed them upon the villages of Darfur. The pattern was precise. Air strikes by Antonov bombers at dawn, then the Janjaweed arriving to finish the work. Villages were burned, men shot, women raped, wells poisoned, and livestock slaughtered. Fields turned black under clouds of smoke. At first, the world did not notice. Darfur was remote, its roads few, its witnesses silenced. But by mid-2004, survivors began crossing into Chad with stories that clawed at belief. They spoke of systematic murder, of children thrown into fires, of women branded to mark their tribe, of mosques turned into killing grounds. Photographs and satellite images confirmed what they said. Entire settlements erased from existence. The international community hesitated, wary of calling it what it was. Words like conflict and crisis were easier than genocide. But the evidence grew impossible to ignore. The United States and human rights groups declared genocide. The United Nations used softer terms, crimes against humanity. But the meaning was clear. Darfur had become the moral wound of the early 21st century. By 2005, while diplomats congratulated themselves for the peace in the south, over 300,000 people had been killed in the west and more than 2 million were displaced. Camps sprang up across the desert, tents stretching beyond the horizon, filled with families who had lost everything except the memory of how it happened. Disease, hunger, and despair became permanent citizens of these places. Journalists who tried to report were expelled. Aid workers were harassed, arrested, or worse. The Sudanese government denied all responsibility, claiming the Janjaweed acted independently. But satellites told another story. Identical burn patterns, villages destroyed in grids coordinated with air raids. It was organized annihilation. In 2009, the International Criminal Court finally acted. Omar al-Bashir became the first sitting head of state indicted for war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. He mocked the charges, calling them colonial lies, but he could not wash off the stain. Around him, the regime tightened into paranoia. Embassies closed. Trade contracts evaporated and Sudan's name became synonymous with atrocity. Meanwhile, the South, barely 5 years into its uneasy peace, looked on in silence. Salva Kiir, now the autonomous government's president, said little. His people had waited half a century for their freedom, and he would not risk it for someone else's tragedy. "We must reach our freedom first," he told his advisors. "Then we can speak of others." His words were cold, but they echoed a terrible logic. In a nation where every region was bleeding, compassion itself had grown scarce. By the end of the decade, Sudan was a country split 3 ways, north and south in fragile truce, west in open genocide. The government in Khartoum clung to power through fear and oil. The world sent peacekeepers too late and too few, constrained by mandates that forbade them from stopping the killing they were sent to observe. In the camps, mothers whispered to their children about a place called home, though none could remember where it was anymore. In Khartoum, the regime declared victory. And in Juba, the countdown to 2011, the promised referendum ticked on like a heartbeat beneath the dust. Sudan was again at a crossroads, one path leading to freedom, another to ruin. But in its history, those 2 paths had always been the same road. January 2011. After more than half a century of war, rebellion, and broken peace, the people of southern Sudan finally stood before the ballot box. The question printed on the paper was achingly simple. Do you wish to remain part of Sudan, or do you wish to become an independent state? There were no slogans, no coercion, no confusion, only an overwhelming unified answer. 98.8% voted for independence. Across Juba, people danced barefoot in the dust. Church bells rang, gunfire crackled in celebration, and tears, old tears, fell freely. For once, the South was not fighting for freedom. It was holding it in its hands. In Khartoum, Omar al-Bashir had little choice but to accept the outcome. The world had watched the referendum too closely, and his army, bled by decades of war and corruption, was in no position to resume the fight. On July 9, 2011, under a pale blue sky, he attended the independence ceremony in Juba. Cameras captured the moment, the old flag of Sudan lowered, the new one raised. A black, red, and green banner with a blue triangle and gold star. The crowd erupted as South Sudan became the world's newest nation. For the first time in memory, there was optimism. Foreign dignitaries praised the triumph of democracy. Aid convoys rolled in, embassies opened, and the United Nations admitted South Sudan as its 193rd member. Garang's dream of self-determination had finally been realized, even if he did not live to see it. Across Africa, people called it a miracle, the end of the continent's longest civil war. But independence, though glorious, was fragile. The very foundations of the new state were built on rubble. Decades of conflict had left no real institutions, no infrastructure, and no national identity strong enough to bind its tribes. The SPLM, the same movement that had fought for liberation, now had to govern. And its transition from army to administration was clumsy and corrupt. Power concentrated in the hands of President Salva Kiir, a pragmatic but wary leader from the Dinka people. His deputy Riek Machar of the Nuer was his opposite, ambitious, volatile, and equally hungry for control. Old rivalries resurfaced like ghosts. Ethnic loyalties trumped national unity. Patronage networks replaced policy. Oil, which once fueled the South streams, became its curse. 3/4 of Sudan's oil fields now lay in South Sudan. But the only pipeline to the Red Sea ran north through Sudan's territory. When the two nations quarreled over transit fees, Juba shut off production entirely, strangling its own economy in protest. Both governments suffered, one losing oil, the other losing income, and both blamed each other. In Khartoum, the loss of oil revenue was catastrophic. Inflation soared, food prices tripled, and protests simmered. The government tightened its grip, turning again to repression and the language of religion to maintain order. Bashir survived by empowering a new generation of loyal enforcers, the Rapid Support Forces (RSF). These troops, drawn largely from the Janjaweed militias of Darfur and commanded by a young warlord named Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemedti, became Bashir's most trusted weapon. Their mission was simple: suppress dissent, secure borders, and protect the regime at any cost. Meanwhile, in the newborn South, the euphoria of independence curdled into betrayal. By late 2013, tensions between Kiir and Machar erupted into open conflict in the capital. Soldiers turned on one another along ethnic lines. Civilians were slaughtered in their homes. The civil war that followed would kill hundreds of thousands and displace millions more, proving that even a nation born in liberation could die in division. Two Sudans now stood side by side, mirror images of chaos. In the north, Bashir clung to power through fear and faith. In the south, Kiir and Machar tore their new country apart in the name of revenge. The borders may have changed, but the curse remained the same. From the mountains of Blue Nile to the deserts of Darfur, one truth lingered like smoke. Freedom without reconciliation is only another kind of war. The dream of peace had been achieved, but peace itself, real lasting peace, was still a stranger. By the late 2010s, Omar al-Bashir's empire was rotting from within. 3 decades of dictatorship had drained Sudan dry. The oil wealth from the 2000s was gone, squandered by corruption and sanctions. Inflation climbed beyond imagination. Bread and fuel vanished from shelves. Khartoum, once the pride of the Nile, was a city of queues, frustration, and whispered defiance. The warlord president, once untouchable, now stood on foundations made of hunger. In December 2018, the spark was struck. In the railway city of Atbara, a loaf of bread tripled in price overnight. Students poured into the streets shouting, "Tasket bis, just fall. That's all." The chant spread faster than any army could contain. Teachers joined, then doctors, merchants, even mothers carrying children. It was not a rebellion of rifles, but of voices. And for the first time since independence, Sudan's people moved as one. The protest spread to Khartoum. Tear gas and bullets met them, but each killing brought thousands more into the streets. At their heart was the Sudanese Professionals Association, a network of unions, activists, and idealists who coordinated strikes through encrypted messages. For months, the people faced live fire, arrests, and torture. But they did not stop. They had seen too many false dawns to accept another. By April 2019, the unthinkable happened. The army turned on its master. Bashir, after 30 brutal years, was arrested by his own generals. Crowds flooded the streets, chanting his name, not in praise, but in triumph. For a fleeting moment, Sudan stood on the edge of transformation. The dictator was gone. The people had won. But revolutions in Sudan have always been followed by echoes of betrayal. The generals who removed Bashir, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and his deputy Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or Hemeti, quickly realized the danger of true democracy. They formed a transitional military council promising elections and partnership with civilians. The world applauded. Protesters stayed in the streets to make sure the promise was kept. Then came June 3, 2019. At dawn, RSF troops, Hemeti's men, surrounded the protest camp outside the army headquarters. Within hours, they opened fire. Hundreds were killed. Bodies were dumped into the Nile to hide the evidence. Women were assaulted in the streets they had reclaimed. The massacre broke the illusion that the old regime had fallen. It had merely changed its uniform. Still, the revolutionaries refused to yield. Massive strikes shut down cities. International outrage mounted. After weeks of tension, a fragile compromise was reached. A joint civilian-military transitional government led by economist Abdallah Hamdok. It was a fragile victory, but it carried hope. For 2 years, Hamdok tried to steer Sudan toward democracy, restoring ties with the West, reforming the economy, and beginning investigations into war crimes. Yet, the old powers, military, Islamist, and oligarchic, worked in the shadows to sabotage it. In October 2021, Buran struck again. Tanks rolled through Khartoum. Ministers were arrested and the civilian government dissolved. Hamdok was briefly reinstated under pressure, then resigned, defeated by the same forces that had haunted Sudan for 70 years. Protests surged anew, but the junta fired live ammunition into crowds. The revolution survived in spirit, not in structure. Meanwhile, another rivalry festered at the heart of the regime. Hemeti's rapid support forces had grown into a state within a state, an army of tens of thousands funded by gold mines, mercenary contracts in Yemen, and foreign sponsors. Buran, commander of the regular army, saw Hemeti as both asset and threat. Hemeti saw himself as Sudan's true future, a man of the people, not of the generals. By early 2023, their alliance had become a death pact. Talks about merging the RSF into the National Army, ostensibly a step toward civilian rule, collapsed in mistrust. Both men accused the other of plotting a coup. Both began moving troops into position. The streets of Khartoum grew quiet with that particular kind of silence that always comes before war. On April 15, 2023, the silence broke. Fighter jets streaked over the capital. Explosions echoed through the city. Smoke poured from the airport as the SAF and RSF turned on each other. 2 men, 2 armies, 1 capital, and a nation that had survived colonialism, coups, and jihad fell once again into fire. What began as revolution had become a relapse into the oldest Sudanese story, the struggle not for freedom but for power. Civilians fled their homes, hospitals filled with the wounded, and the Nile itself ran dark with smoke. The people who had once chanted for bread and liberty now whispered only one prayer: to live through another night. What began in April 2023 as a contest between 2 generals has by November 2025 become something far worse. The war for Khartoum, the war for the illusion of power, has consumed Sudan whole. What remains is not a country at war, but a country being erased in real time. At first, the world watched the smoke rising over the capital. Fighter jets screeched above the Nile. Artillery shells flattened neighborhoods that had once pulsed with cafes, universities, and marketplaces. Families fled across bridges, clutching children and small bundles of food. For weeks, the headlines spoke of battles for control. But control soon became meaningless. 2 years later, the capital lies in ruin, its banks empty, its ministries shelled, its streets patrolled by ghosts. The true horror has moved westward to Darfur. There, history has returned with nightmarish precision. The rapid support forces, descendants of the Janjaweed, marched through villages and towns under a banner of vengeance and profit. El Fasher, the last government stronghold in the region, endured an 18-month siege that starved its people into submission. When the RSF finally entered in late October 2025, the city fell not in battle but in slaughter. Survivors speak of men dragged from their homes and executed in front of their families, of women taken in trucks, of children forced to bury the dead. Entire districts were burned to ash. In one of the most horrifying episodes, RSF troops stormed El Fasher's main hospital, once the region's largest, killing at least 460 patients and staff who had sought shelter there. Satellite imagery now shows hundreds of new burial mounds, mass graves so large they can be seen from orbit. Human rights drones have filmed bulldozers covering corpses under sand, while RSF fighters celebrate nearby. The United Nations calls it the most systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing in modern Sudanese history. The International Committee of the Red Cross warned, "History is repeating itself. Across Darfur, the pattern repeats. El Geneina, Nyala, Zelingii, each a name in a growing litany of ruin. Hundreds of thousands trek on foot toward Chad and South Sudan, their shadows stretching across the desert. The lucky reach camps already overflowing with hunger and disease. The unlucky vanish between dunes. Meanwhile, the Sudanese armed forces cling to the eastern cities, Port Sudan, Atbara, Wad Madani, like a government in exile. But the army is splintered, its soldiers unpaid and starving. Air strikes level entire blocks to deny them to the enemy, killing more civilians than fighters. The generals Burin and what remains of his circle speak of victory. Yet they preside over famine, not freedom. In Kordofan, famine has already been declared. Mothers boil leaves for their children, and wells have become graves for those who collapse before reaching them. By early November 2025, more than 14 million Sudanese have fled their homes, the largest displacement crisis on Earth. Disease spreads through camps in Chad and Egypt. Aid shipments shrink under constant looting. Inside Sudan, law has disintegrated entirely. The RSF governs its territories through extortion and terror, trading looted gold for weapons. The SAF, desperate and cornered, bombs anything that moves. Between them, civilians exist only as bargaining chips in a game without rules. The United Nations convenes emergency sessions. The African Union calls for ceasefires, and foreign envoys circulate in air-conditioned rooms. But every truce lasts hours, not days. Each side accuses the other of war crimes, even as both commit them. Words like ceasefire and negotiation have become as hollow as the ministries they once adorned. The International Criminal Court has already opened a formal investigation into El Fasher, calling the massacre a possible genocide-scale crime reminiscent of Rwanda, 1994. In Khartoum, nothing remains to fight for. The city that once joined two Niles has become a skeleton. Its bridges shattered, its skyline gutted, its people scattered. The call to prayer still echoes from a few surviving minarets, but it carries no congregation. The war has devoured not only lives, but meaning. And yet, within the dust, fragments of humanity persist. A teacher still writes lessons on a broken chalkboard in a refugee camp. A nurse still sterilizes bandages with boiled rainwater. A mother still whispers to her child that peace will come. These small acts, fragile, defiant, are all that remain of Sudan's civilization. 70 years have passed since the Torit Mutiny first set this land aflame. From the first gunshots of 1955 to the mass graves of El Fasher in 2025, every generation has inherited the same war under a new name. Sudan's history reads like one long echo of betrayal: independence without unity, peace without justice, revolution without redemption. Now the maps show emptiness where nations once stood. And as famine spreads, graves multiply, and silence deepens, the question that has haunted Sudan since its birth returns one last time. Was there ever truly one Sudan to begin with?